We're probably going to play a little bit of pass the parcel here. John O'Connell is the Chief Executive of the Taxpayers Alliance over in the UK. Here at the ATA, we model a lot of what we do after the Taxpayers Alliance over there. We figure we may as well try and follow in the footsteps of the best of the best. So John, from one tax fighter to another, thank you for joining this panel. Thank you for joining this conference, and I'll pass over to you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And it's 10 o'clock here in the UK, so I don't know if that's too early to crack open a beer. Probably not. I think it might be fine. But it's a pleasure to join you, albeit digitally. I've very much enjoyed coming to the Friedman conference for the past 2 years, and it's a shame to not have it live in Sydney this year. But you guys are doing a fantastic job of running it digitally. So congratulations. I think it's a model that everybody else should be looking at. A very exciting session this morning. We're talking about the UK, Australia, and the Commonwealth after Brexit. First up, we're going to hear from Senator Amanda Stoker. She's the Liberal member of the Australian Senate, representing Queensland since March 2018. She's a lawyer by trade and was until recently a member of Level 27 Chambers and Vice President of the Women Lawyers Association of Queensland. So I'll hand over to you, Senator Stoker, to give us an overview of what you think the relationship between the UK, Australia, and the rest of the Commonwealth could look like after Brexit.
Thank you so much, John, for the warm welcome. I really appreciate it. And also to Brian and John in Sydney, I really appreciate the introduction. It really is a joy to be here. And look, I confess that after being asked to share a panel with the incredible Dan Hannan, it didn't take long before I thought, well, sugar, anything I've got to say is going to pale in comparison with what he will do as one of the people who did so much to make Brexit happen, and of course being the incredible mind that he is. So I'm sure he won't disappoint, but I've been given the blessing of going first so that I seem at least a little bit interesting. Can I acknowledge the organisers of Friedman 8, not just for continuing the legacy of Milton Friedman's wonderful thinking and beliefs, but also for adapting so well to these challenging times. The in-person conference has been so good for so many years. Maybe this was meant to happen to help increase your global reach. And as I understand it, it has reached an awfully long way this year, so well done. Can I also add a really special acknowledgement to John Stone, who I am delighted to call a friend. I'm so pleased to hear he's been honoured by this conference for the lifetime he has spent evangelising for free markets and for federalism, two things that I care about deeply. And so to hear that he has been recognised is a wonderful thing. I met him first as a really young lawyer attending my first Samuel Griffith Society conference, and he had the fire in the belly then, and in the 15 years since, it hasn't weakened at all. So thank you for everything you do for our beliefs and for this country, John. You are a very good egg. All right, hands up. At the height of the Cold War, Sir Robert Menzies used the phrase great and powerful friends to describe the protective shield that was offered to Australia by its Commonwealth and US allies in the face of communism in Asia. Menzies' call to work in concert with our great and powerful friends is as relevant now as it was then, as we find ourselves in an increasingly unstable and in many ways threatening world, one that is characterised by rising populism, sustained attacks on liberal trade, and a transfer of economic power to a less understood Asia. It's exactly, though, at this time that Australia should be seeking to embolden its relationships with our great and powerful Commonwealth friends. It's not simply an idea that came from an Australian Prime Minister. So Winston Churchill also emphasised the importance of strong relationships between Commonwealth countries over mere geographic closeness. He said, to quote, "We are with Europe, but we are not of it. We're linked, but we're not combined. We are interested, but we're not absorbed. If Britain must choose between Europe and the open sea, she must always choose the open sea." Close quote. And the same could be said of the relationship these days between Australia and Asia. An alternative way to look at this is, COVID apart, that geography has never been less of an issue in international trade, even for a country that is as far away from everything as Australia is. It was geography that drove Britain into the EU and the belief that trade with it would be simpler and easier. But it's also the force that led Australia into closer ties with Asia. And so, since geography isn't the issue it once was, I'd suggest that there's more room for us to form our partnerships based on alignments of thinking and culture in making an assessment of who should become our closest trading partners. Calls for strengthened relationships between Commonwealth countries have been increasing for some time now, particularly calls for closer cooperation between Commonwealth nations, that is, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. A petition that was started by Commonwealth International has already gathered 300,000 signatures and has been publicly supported by members of parliament across all of those countries. While Commonwealth nations, along with the US, have a long history of cooperation with respect to matters like intelligence and security through most recently the Five Eyes Alliance, free trade and movement of people between Commonwealth nations has yet to fully reach its potential. Now, the benefits of free trade between Commonwealth nations are, I suggest, pretty obvious, particularly in this audience. So we don't need to pore over them at length. If I'm not in a crowd of people who value free trade, then can somebody point me to the Friedman conference? But to highlight the point, I suppose, there is no greater system or regime that has lifted the masses from poverty than free trade and free market capitalism. In 1990, 38% of human beings lived in extreme poverty. Today, that figure's 8%. Simply put, free trade is the best known instrument for poverty alleviation in the human history as we know it. As Milton Friedman himself proclaimed, the record of history is absolutely clear. There is no alternative way so far discovered of improving the lot of ordinary people that can hold a candle to the productive capacities that are unleashed by the free enterprise system. Now, I should add that the measure in those statistics is using an objective measure of what constitutes poverty, not the, I would suggest, somewhat dishonest measure used in this country, where the position of the poverty line moves with increasing living standards. So here, there will always be, because the standard is always changing, around the same number of people who are living below the poverty line. But in many ways, that's a digression from the subject. It is the knowledge of the power of free trade that's driven the coalition to work tirelessly since coming to government to conclude free trade agreements. They're not quick things to conclude, but since 2013, the government has implemented free trade agreements with Korea, Japan, China, Hong Kong, Peru, and Indonesia, with the TPP 11. Now, there's a clear theme from all of this. Most of our efforts towards freer trade have been focused on Asia. However, with Australia, New Zealand, and Canada all pushing for post-Brexit free trade agreements with Britain, we should now turn our attention to securing free trade between the Commonwealth nations and other Commonwealth nations, I would suggest. So what would a Commonwealth free trade agreement look like? Well, for one, the exchange of goods and services between all four countries should be free of all tariffs and quotas. Additionally, each country's product and service standards should be recognised in the other. That should include the mutual recognition of the standards of goods, of services, of professional qualifications, as well as the free movement of people. As former Prime Minister Tony Abbott put it once, if a car is fit to be sold in Britain, it's fit to be sold in Australia. If a doctor is fit to practice in Australia, he or she is fit to practice in the UK. I'd suggest mutual recognition is much better an option to the common regulation and standardisation practices that underpin most trade deals and which have contributed to Britain's exit from the EU. The EU really was a bureaucratic union based on coercion, and I'd suggest that should not be the model that's adopted going into the future. Instead, any agreement that's struck should facilitate commerce and competition in a way that makes it truly free, that truly harnesses the benefits of free trade. Some have suggested that such an agreement could be based on the framework that's already in place between Australia and New Zealand in the form of the Australia-New Zealand Closer Economic Relations Trade Agreement. That's called the CRE for those people who have to say such a long title often. And it prohibits all tariffs and trade restrictions between Australia and New Zealand and has measures to minimise market distortions and export subsidies. It also covers the mutual recognition of goods and occupations. I don't want to labour the point, but it should absolutely be the case that an economic agreement between Kansak nations should not amount to a political union of the kind we saw in the EU. Australia and other Kansak nations won't, in my view, accept being constrained by the statism and heavy-handed bureaucracy that the British people rejected when they approved the Brexit referendum. There should be no overarching institutions or courts like the European Court of Justice issuing directives to Australia on what we can and can't legislate on. Simple mutual recognition of goods and services rather than regulatory harmonisation will ensure that Australia's institutions and sovereignty remain intact. It also means that competing states, which despite our good relationships, all of the Kansak nations remain, those competitive tensions can still be harnessed to bring out the kinds of innovation and the kinds of efficiencies that we expect in a competitive market. We lose many of those if we take on an EU-style status kind of arrangement. Besides the obvious benefits of free trade between Commonwealth countries, Brexit clearly provides Britain with an additional reason to expedite such an arrangement. But Australia too has a strategic geopolitical reason to quickly seek out stronger ties with Commonwealth countries, namely an over-reliance on what has become an increasingly assertive Chinese government. But before I move on to that, let me say that any free trade arrangement between the Kansak nations will make a difference. But if we really want it to supercharge Australia's economy, we need to do our share on the Australian government side too. And that means combing through what is, I would suggest, a weighty load of legislative and regulatory burden here to simplify it, to clarify it, and to make it so much easier for Australian goods to be able to access international markets and to make it easier for Australian businesses to import and then adapt what they need to Australian conditions. I've made this a bit of a mission during the COVID period to just slowly but surely work my way through legislation, working out what we do and don't truly need. And I've not only been horrified by the quantity, but I've seen examples in every state. I've seen examples at the federal level of ways that we can drastically cut the burden that is faced by Australian individuals and businesses as they seek to go about making a living. If we do our share on home soil, the impact that we can have in a competitive Kansak free market will be accelerated greatly. So back to Australia's over-reliance on China. The COVID-19 panic has really, I think, revealed the extent to which Australia has become dependent on the Chinese market. After the Australian government called for an independent inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus, something that really shouldn't be controversial, it is the sensible thing to do after any kind of virus outbreak or any kind of crisis situation. Investigate and learn from it. Shouldn't have been a controversial thought. But it didn't go down very well with the Chinese government. Similarly, when Australia recognised the great work that Taiwan did in managing the COVID-19 situation and supported their membership of the World Health Organization, the Chinese government urged Chinese tourists and students not to come to Australia while slapping an 80% tariff on Australian barley exports, which typically account for more than half of Australia's total barley exports. You can imagine the anxiety that would have caused for an Australian barley farmer, half of their market suddenly not viable. So clearly we have become too economically dependent on China. And without wanting to labour the point. It's a nation that doesn't share our culture or our values. Now, that's not to say their culture isn't valuable or interesting. It is both of those things. It's also not to say that we shouldn't try and understand it. Indeed, I think it would be folly for any Australian business to set up shop in China or establish critical relationships in the Chinese market without really seeking to understand the differences in Chinese thinking as compared to the way that we in the West go about it. It really is a different way of thinking altogether. And if you want to know more about this, Nisbet's written a great book called The Geography of Thought, and it explains the different ways that the Western tradition, almost by osmosis from growing up in this environment, means we believe certain things and act a certain way, including in trade and commerce, that don't always align with what we can expect when we go into, for instance, the Chinese market. But CANZL presents an opportunity for Australia to diversify our trade relationships so that we have more of our eggs in the baskets of nations who share our political, cultural and institutional connections. CANZL nations share much in common with us. Common law legal systems. That's something that should not be dismissed lightly. It is incredibly significant to know that your trade partner comes not just from a system of common law, but a system in which the rule of law is truly understood, where contracts are honoured, where the failure to honour contracts has consequences. These things matter a great deal in terms of the risk that we face when we trade. And yet they aren't things we can take for granted in every market. But in the CANZL nations, we can. We share the English language. And even in those parts of the Commonwealth where the English language may not be a first language, it's nevertheless present and spoken widely. Parliamentary democracy based on the Westminster tradition helps a great deal too. And respect for human rights, market economies, I've mentioned the rule of law, I've mentioned contracts, and all of those things together mean we can have great comfort in building trade relationships based on these familiar and recognisable connections. These cultural differences aren't just a function of shared history and heritage, although those things are important. They represent fundamental differences in the way different cultures think. Again, that's not a judgment of those who think according to the Asian tradition, but it is to say that those who are coming from the West, people like myself, who understand and value what we do in the West and think it's pretty darn good, need to make a really conscious effort to understand the ways in which things are done differently in Asia. And I'll give you an example that has been highlighted to me during the couple of years of parliamentary service that I've done. And it's this. When Australians, and no doubt other CANZL nations, go to trade, they think of trade relationships as being a separate and self-contained bucket, if I can describe it that way. They expect businesses on the other side to be operating according to similar kinds of norms. They expect, unless they're dealing with a government itself, they expect private companies to be operating privately in their own interests rather than being overly influenced by governmental actors. And they expect that there's a certain continuity of information within that bucket. Similarly, Australians would consider defence and security interests in a different bucket entirely, and politics perhaps in a third bucket. When you're dealing in China, you need to understand that there really only is one big bucket, and the contents of each of our three buckets are fair game for security, trade, political interests to be used to influence other items or other buckets from the Australian way of thinking. And that makes an awfully big difference when it comes to the degree of access to information, the degree of access to, for instance, critical infrastructure that we can provide to a foreign operation that doesn't necessarily operate according to the same values and norms as us. None of this is to say we shouldn't trade with China. We absolutely should. And we should do it on a respectful basis. We should do it as equals, not as some minor partner or a subservient nation in the relationship. That relationship is worth something to Australia, and we should nurture and cultivate it. But that doesn't mean appeasement. It doesn't mean that we cave at every demand. And we've noticed in the last, and I'm speaking really as a personal commentator here, there's been an awful lot of demands over the last 10 years, and they've been increasing in their size and in their frequency. I'm a mother of 3 kids, and there's one thing I've learned, and that is that bullies don't respond to appeasement. If you give the bully your lunch money, they come back the next day and ask for more lunch money and maybe that nice new hat you've got. And if you give in again, the next time they come, they want your lunch money, your hat, and your new sneakers. Bullies require that we stand up for ourselves. And one of the ways that we're able to be more assertive of our own interests is to have diversified our trade relationships so that we aren't vulnerable to a Chinese Communist Party decision to turn off the tap of trade at whim. There's profoundly different ways of thinking that arise in the Asian tradition versus in the Australian. Or I might say the Eastern and the Western tradition, to be a little bit more expansive. And they've existed for thousands of years, dating back to ancient Greece. And for China, it goes back as far as Confucius. I mean, if you compare the writings and philosophies of Homer to the writings and philosophies of Confucius, you can see something of the contrast in the way that these different groups think. It's profoundly different social relations, different ways of thinking about the nature of the world, about time, about our place in history, and about the role that as individuals we play in shaping that history. There are several important implications that arise from this. First, Eastern and Western cultures assign vastly different priorities to and roles for the law in society. The ratio, for instance, of lawyers to engineers in the US is 40 times higher than it is in Japan. Second, there is a stark divergence in the way that China, for instance, views human rights to the way that the West does. There's, in the West, a strong emphasis on the relationship between individuals and the state and the protection of fundamental freedoms for the individual as against the state, though they always need defending. And in Australia, they've probably, in the last decade, been under fire more than most of us would like to have seen. But at least in the Western tradition, there is a recognition that all individuals are unique and separate and have something interesting and different to offer. In contrast, those in East Asia view societies not as aggregates of individuals, but as collectives of people. That means there can often be very little conception of individual rights. The point from this is that there is an undeniable comfort and stability in trading with people who think, rationalise, perceive and analyse in the same way that we do. If I could borrow the language of the wonderful Dan Hannan, who I think might have joined us on the line, cultural proximity trumps geography. And the data that is provided by the Royal Commonwealth Society supports this. Free movement of people between Kansas nations enjoys overwhelming majority support, with 70% support in Australia, 72% in Canada, 82% in New Zealand, and 58% support in the UK. And that lower number in the UK, I think, is probably reasonable given their recent experience with the free movement of people through the EU. The size and diversity of the Commonwealth economy would easily allow for Australia to rapidly diversify its trading interests in a way that suits not just our economic interests, but also our political and strategic interests. And they remain important. The combined economy of the Commonwealth is the 4th largest in the world, behind the US, EU, and China, and it surpassed the Eurozone in 2012. It's got a combined population of 2.4 billion people across 6 continents, with a total GDP of $6.5 trillion US dollars. Australian agriculture and wine particularly stand to benefit from a deal like this. And both of those industries face increasing threats of trade boycotts from China. That doesn't mean we turn away from our Asian trading partners. And indeed, there's one Commonwealth country in Asia that shouldn't be overlooked, because building stronger ties with India presents a monumental economic opportunity for Australia, being the world's largest democracy with a market of 1.3 billion people. It's youthful, it's diversified, it provides export opportunities for us in education, agriculture, energy, resources, tourism, healthcare, financial services, infrastructure, and science. We've had remarkable growth in trade with India in recent years. It was $13.6 billion in 2007, and by 2018, we were at $30.4 billion. So to wrap this up, I think we can benefit greatly from enhanced economic ties with other Commonwealth nations, and particularly with the Cairns nations. And I'd suggest that at a time when many are far too quick to seek to tear down and erase history, we could learn an awful lot by looking to the wisdom of the past, and the relationships that were so strong during the period of the Commonwealth's preeminence. Then we should be doing that now. We must use it to find solutions to our current challenges. And Menzies and Churchill's vision for a strong and powerful Commonwealth provides us with a ready-made formula for mitigating the many security and economic threats that we face. Freer trade and movement between Commonwealth nations who share our history, our culture, and our language is, in my view, part of the way we need to go about securing prosperity for Australians in what are tenser and more turbulent times than we have seen for some time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay. Senator Stoker, thank you so much. We do have Daniel Hannan join us on the line now, so I'm going to hand straight over to him. He doesn't need much introduction, but he's my favourite kind of politician in that he actively campaigned to abolish his own position as a member of the European Parliament, and successfully did so. He was an MEP for 21 years and now is a prominent author, commentator, and speaker. And I'll hand straight over to the great Daniel Hannan.
Well, thank you very much, John. Good evening, you blokes watching in Australia. Good morning to anyone watching on this time zone. It is a huge pleasure to be here with fellow freedom lovers and Friedmanites. And I think the Melbourne hosts said this is the graveyard slot. Well, I'll try, like the gravedigger in Hamlet, nonetheless, to say something thought-provoking. The move away from the EU, the pivot back to the Anglosphere, seems to me the correction of a historic mistake. The European Union was a child of its time. It was put together in an age when manufacturing was a much bigger part of the economy than services, when refrigeration was expensive, when freight costs were high, and it's been pretty much left redundant by technological advance. And you just heard, brilliantly put by Amanda Stoker, the case for geographical proximity for cultural proximity trumping geographical proximity. Amanda, by the way, absolutely wonderful speech, best kind of politician. She's instinctively right on every issue, great lover of liberty and a great Australian patriot. The people of Queensland are very lucky to have her. So I don't really want to elaborate what kind of trade deal we can have. I think Amanda just made that case brilliantly. It should be all-encompassing, it should be comprehensive, it should cover goods and services and professional qualifications, and it should be based, as she quoted Tony Abbott saying, on the principle that what goes in your country goes in mine, and vice versa. That's the way of really driving competition, of having trade that works for the little guy rather than for the big corporates, of a free trade agreement that is based around the interests of the consumer rather than the producer. The more interesting and challenging question, taking on what Amanda said, is how do we win that argument now? Because we should be honest, we limited government free trade types. The moment that the world is passing through with the epidemic and the subsequent lockdowns is unfriendly to our worldview. A plague or a pestilence, or at least the perceived threat of one, flicks switches in our brains. It throws us back onto some very basic Stone Age instincts. We allow ourselves to be taken over by these kind of Paleolithic algorithms. Keep your kids close, hunker down, avoid strangers. They probably carry pathogens. Produce more of your own stuff, hoard your own food. And when these things are translated into policy terms in a modern society, it takes the form of border closures, flight bans, desire to reshore jobs, and to grow more of our own stuff. I mean, I've been shocked over the last 3 or 4 months by how many fellow conservatives who are normally good, reliable free market types, who've been saying to me as a result of the coronavirus disruptions, oh, but surely, Hannon, even you need to accept that there is now a need for us to be more self-sufficient, that we can't be so reliant on imports, that we need to be able to look after ourselves. Now, if you think about it logically, the coronavirus crisis shows exactly the opposite, right? The one thing that worked beautifully throughout all of the disruptions were global supply chains for food and other necessary items. If anything has been taught by the last 3 months, it's the vital need to be able to continue to import what you need from wherever you need it. If I can be allowed a parochial English observation, that the closures hit during what our farmers and our retailers call the hungry gap, right? From late March to early May in Britain is basically when we don't produce any food. We've run out of the old winter crops. We're not producing any more cabbages and carrots and potatoes and turnips, but we haven't yet reached the first harvests. So if we hadn't been able to import whatever we needed, we would have been dependent on rhubarb and asparagus and maybe a bit of nettle soup. Logically, we should have drawn the inference that imports matter a great deal. Not just food, but masks or gloves or potential ingredients in vaccines or whatever it is. No country is going to happen to be sitting on all that stuff just on the off chance that exactly the right kind of disease is going to come along and vindicate its decision to stockpile, right? We need to have a diversity of supply. And I think this is particularly relevant. If I take on what Amanda was saying about relations with China, I agree with her. I think there is a cultural difference that has thrown the Western democracies together and has reminded us of what we have in common. I don't think that the correct response is to curtail our trade with the world's second largest economy. I think there are political and diplomatic sanctions available to us, but economic sanctions are almost never a good idea. Almost by definition, they end up hurting the wrong people. They end up hurting ordinary people in your own country and ordinary people in the country with which you're not trading, and shoring up support for an autocratic regime. But I do buy the argument that a number of businesses and a number of governments around the world over the last 10 or 12 weeks have realized how dependent they are on supply chains coming from one country where the government has an unusual control over the private sector. But here's the thing. If we want to diversify away from China, the answer is not just to replace what we're buying from China with stuff we're making ourselves, because stuff we're making ourselves is still vulnerable to a localized shock or a localized disruption. Genuine security of supply does not mean trying to produce all of your own stuff. Genuine security of supply means having a diverse plurality of global supply chains so that you can always get what you need from somewhere, because the whole world isn't all going to be disrupted at the same moment. And if you want a neat illustration of that in practical terms, consider, if you like, the two countries that stand at the outermost ends of the spectrum in terms of self-sufficiency. At one end of the spectrum, there is one country in the world that has raised self-sufficiency to the primary ruling principle of politics, and that's North Korea. Juche, they call it, self-sufficiency, right? They try and substitute all imports, grow and produce and manufacture everything they need, and they are perhaps the last polity on earth that still experiences man-made famines. At the other end of that scale, you have Singapore. Singapore basically produces no food, imports everything it needs, has the lowest food prices in the world, and the greatest security of supply. Now, where would you rather live? Here's the thing. That is a difficult and counterintuitive argument to make, even in normal times. We are, as I say, driven by our caveman instincts. And one of those instincts is to hoard food so as to get through the winter, right? So people are always uneasy when they're told that we're reliant on imports, whether it's for food or combine harvesters or for whatever it is. And yet, every country that tries to reduce its dependence on others by artificially boosting domestic production in defiance of where the market demand is, always ends up making itself poor. This is, as I say, a difficult argument. The protectionist case, the mercantilist case, rests on a number of propositions that sound completely reasonable, but that all turn out to be specious. So whether it's in Brussels or in Beijing, or whether it's Donald Trump, the mercantilist is able to say a number of things that strike everyone as common sense, even though they all turn out to be false. We can't carry on with a trade deficit. We can't compete with countries that have slave wage economies. We need to protect strategic industries. We need to be more self-sufficient in food. All of these things sound totally reasonable. It's just that when you try and pursue them, they always end up making you poorer. And if that was a difficult argument to win in January, it is a far tougher argument to win now. So what do we do about it? Those of us who recognize the Friedmanite case for free commerce and free competition. You know what? You do it. If it's an argument that you can't win intellectually because of the counterintuitive nature of it, you win it by showing the practical success. And actually, Australia and New Zealand are outstanding examples of where that has happened. Just as Hong Kong and Singapore liberalized uncontroversially, once they'd done it, no one wanted to go back, so Australia and New Zealand have followed. I mean, I'm just old enough to remember the immense rows when New Zealand liberalized its agriculture in the late 1980s, and the protest marches and the terror of all the Kiwi farmers. You won't find anyone now who wants to go back. If there is a single New Zealand farmer out there who thinks that they were better off under the old system, I've yet to hear from. Similarly, what an amazing thing in Australia that the last car could roll off the last production line and no one is that bothered. That people accept now that Australia is better off buying cheaper stuff, being part of an integrated global system. That's the way to win the argument. You demonstrate in practice that it works, that it delivers for everybody, but especially for people on low incomes, who are those who stand to gain the most from a fall in prices. Amanda mentioned the Australian-New Zealand deal. I think this is probably the best one in the world at the moment, in that it is the one that most closely approximates the idea of complete mutual recognition, and it covers goods, services, and professional qualifications. I think the last time I was in Australia, someone explained to me that a New Zealand school teacher can work more easily in any Australian state than a qualified Australian teacher from a different state, right? But that's how total the mutual recognition is, that you don't have to do any new exams or get any new qualifications. There have been, I think, 2 occasions when the ANCERTA deal, whatever you want to call it, it changes its name regularly, have been challenged. One was to do with Australian apple farmers trying to keep out Kiwi apples. And the other, I think, has to do with where and at what point you have to classify alternative medicines as normal medicines and test them accordingly. Do you know what? I'll take that, right? If those are the only disruptions to an otherwise open market, what a fantastic system. And we could do a lot worse than to try and make that a tripartite system with the United Kingdom and then extend it to other Anglosphere markets. 2 more points, just building on this idea of demonstrating the merits of free trade in practice. First, I'm delighted to say that yesterday, the Secretary of State for Trade here, the first trade secretary we've had in 40 years actually to have a job, had a meeting with all of the ambassadors from the CPTPP nations with a view to beginning the process of UK accession to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, there may be some who will say, well, that's a bit odd. You know, in what sense is the United Kingdom a Pacific nation? And the answer is actually we are technically a Pacific nation because we own Pitcairn, which is pretty much slap bang in the middle. And in fact, that gives us a larger share of Pacific waters than the UK coastline does of Atlantic waters. But let's allow that Pitcairn is a small place with a small population. The truth is that we are drawn to the CPTPP, not so much by geography as by this cultural proximity, by the exceptionally close links that we have with Australia, with New Zealand, with Canada, and indeed with Singapore, Malaysia, and other countries in the Pacific region. I think the growth of the Pacific is one of the elemental geopolitical facts of the 21st century. Just as the 18th century saw a shift in the focus of world trade and civilization from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, so our own century has seen an equivalent shift from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And you see this even within countries, even countries like the United States and Canada that have Atlantic and Pacific coasts have seen, if you like, an internal domestic shift towards their west coasts in terms of where the center of economic gravity lies. This means that places like Australia and New Zealand are enormously well positioned, but also countries like the UK that have these exceptionally close links, resting on interoperable regulatory systems, are, if you like, in a way to get some of that advantage spilling over into their own markets. So I want us to be incredibly ambitious. Joining CPTPP is important, but I want us to go much further, starting with countries like Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, the ones that are the most open, in having a system where you have assumed complete mutual recognition, where whatever is legal in one country is legal in all of the others. And I'm only going to, I think, correct one point that the wonderful and brilliant Amanda made, which is she said that the Commonwealth was the fourth biggest economy if you count the EU as a single country. But actually, that's not true now, because the United Kingdom has left the EU, and that actually shifts the balance. So the Commonwealth is now, now that the UK is no longer an EU member and is no longer being counted in that tally, is now the larger economy. But whichever is bigger now, I don't think there's any doubt as to which one is going to grow faster in the next 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, right? This is a very good place to be, a flexible, large network, not a trade bloc, EU style, but a network based around property rights, individual freedom, and recognition of the value of competition, whether it happens domestically or internationally. I think that places us in a very strong position, the English-speaking countries, to continue to exert our benign pull over the affairs of humanity. Amanda quoted Menzies' words at during the Second World War. It's worth taking a moment to consider what it is that the English-speaking peoples have achieved, not only on their own behalf, but in terms of making the world safer for personal autonomy and for freedom. A lot of the human rights, what we think of as the universal values that we take for granted, uncensored newspapers, regular elections, equality between men and women, jury trials, habeas corpus, we call these universal values. But in reality, these were precepts overwhelmingly developed in the language in which you're now listening to me. And if we call them Western values or universal values, you know, we're kind of being polite. If they became universal values, it was because of a series of military triumphs by the English-speaking peoples. Imagine that the Second World War had ended differently. Or imagine that the Cold War had ended differently. There had been nothing universal about them then. I'm convinced that our song is not yet sung. We still have an immense amount to contribute to the happiness of the human race. And together, we're just getting started.
John, you just need to turn your microphone on there for us, mate. You've still got yourself muted.
Yeah, I think he's sort of. How about now? Yeah. Dan, thank you very much, and thanks to the wonders of this digital conference and the technology, I'm going to ask some questions that have been submitted. The first one I'm going to ask to Amanda, if you don't mind. It's from Peter Shepherd, who asks, free trade agreements are a misnomer. Why can't the members of CANZUK unite and adopt unilateral free trade, i.e., why do we need a deal?
Well, I mean, they're sort of same things by different names. If they come together and they agree that they're going to do completely free trade, well, that's also a deal in another person's language. So I'm very happy for any deal to be pretty much what is being described by the questioner.
So a
Can I add
deal
one?
in a loop. Oh,
Can I add
please do,
one?
Dan. Yeah.
So, I mean, of course, any proper Friedmanite knows that you don't need trade deals. In a perfect world, everyone just removes all of the barriers themselves and allows customers to sell to whom they want, and so on. In practical terms, I say this after 21 years in elected politics, it is almost impossible to win that argument unless there is a sense of reciprocity, because people really don't get that counterintuitive case that the main value to you comes from cheaper imports. And I think there is a value in starting with the countries that have the most similar systems, where it's easiest, if you like, to trust another country's regulator, which is what mutual recognition is all about. And I think that the obvious place to start is with a core of Anglosphere states. I'm not particularly hung up on Kansas. At the moment, I would say Singapore is a much keener free trader than Canada is. The Trudeau government in Canada has been rather disappointing. It's the outlier. It's why the UK is prioritizing Australia and New Zealand as its first free trade agreements rather than Canada. It would have been a different story if Andrew Scheer had won the last general election there. But Kansas is, as I think we all see, and as Amanda said, it's an incredibly strong alliance in every other sense. Right? The Five Eyes deal and the proximity we have, including with the United States, even on nuclear technology, I think is without precedent among sovereign countries in the world. What hasn't followed up until now is the trade, because UK trade until the 1st of January next year is controlled by the EU. And that's where we now have the opportunity to make some real progress.
Okay. A question that's anonymous, unfortunately, but I'm going to combine it with another question from Chris Berg too. So, Dan, are you worried that the pro-national sovereignty argument that we made in the Brexit campaign has actually given momentum to sort of populist anti-free trade arguments? And if that is the case, how do we communicate what are otherwise considered elite concerns, i.e. deregulation, lower corporation tax, and these kinds of things?
I think the world as a whole is going through a populist spasm. And I think it's quite tough to argue that that is happening more in the UK than in the United States or France or Italy or India or Turkey or wherever. I think we're going through an authoritarian moment, and that was already underway even before the COVID crisis hit, which will exacerbate it. And we small government people should have the honesty to accept this, right? We were in a minority already, but we're going to be in a much smaller minority now, because psychologists have observed this. The jury is no longer out on this. When you get something of this kind, a perception of a shared communal threat, it makes people more illiberal. It makes people more authoritarian. It pushes the case for economic nationalism, and indeed for a more authoritarian social system, and for reasons that have tribal evolutionary roots. So I think we're always going to struggle, if you like, to win an overall libertarian case. If you're going out from first principles and saying this is why drugs should be liberalized and etc., you're going to lose. What you need to do is to pick the examples of where you can win, where the conservative and libertarian worldviews come together, and where you can plainly deliver. And that's on things like welfare reform, school choice, lower taxes. Those are arguments that we can win. And the most successful reforming free market leaders, Margaret Thatcher in my country, Ronald Reagan, John Howard, have been the ones who have been able to combine that, if you like, liberal economics with a wider cultural conservatism, so that they keep together the coalition and win the elections.
Amanda, do you have a similar issue in Australia in a sort of more populist age, communicating policies that again might be considered elite, such as deregulation or lower, simpler corporate taxes and these kind of issues?
Yeah, we do have this problem. We have very vocal minor parties that reflect these populist kind of ideas. Groups like Katter, Bob Katter and his party here in Queensland, One Nation, which is headed by Pauline Hanson, prey upon people who find these populist ideas appealing. And in many ways, they can drive aspects of the populist into the major parties too. And it's generally very unhelpful. The knack, and I can't pretend I've mastered it, but I'm certainly trying, is, I think, to take the values that we think are really important and can be spoken of in an elite kind of way so that they only appeal to the educated, and break them down into what they mean for a guy who's on the tools as a tradesman. What does it mean for a nurse? What does it mean for a teacher? What does it mean for the person who's running a corner shop? And really spell out how it works for them. I mean, that's how you need to go about winning any political argument, really. I just think that there hasn't necessarily been as much effort put into plainly communicating that well over the last 15, 20 years.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you both to Senator Stoker and to Dan Hannan. It was an illuminating chat as ever, and it was amazing that we were able to do it cross continents in that way, which makes me confident that Kanzuk is going to be easy. So with that, I'm going to thank you both and hand back to Australia.
Thank you.
And thank you, and thank you, Dan. Excellent. That was a great session. That was a lot of fun. Thank you for all contributing. Thank you, Dan, for giving us a few more grey hairs.